Hey guys, this is Mr. Shorten. Just getting started today to talk to you about the 13 colonies so that you'll be ready to come in class. We can do some deeper stuff. Um, so, starting off here, we have the New England colonies. They're in the Northeast. There are a few of those. You have Massachusetts during this time. This top part up here is actually still Massachusetts. Today, this part is also Massachusetts. We now call this Maine, but back then there were two of them. Two places that were still run by the same government. You have New Hampshire, right here in the middle. You have Rhode Island, this little teeny tiny state. You have Connecticut, Massachusetts, the second part, and that's all of that stuff. And I think looks like I might be missing Vermont, but so reasons for coming to the United States. Why did people come here? Some people didn't like the Church of England. Basically, at this point in time, there's a lot of religious strife going on. You have a lot of back and forth with the different kings and queens, some being Catholic, some being Protestant. There's a lot of conflict. And there's a new group that call themselves the Puritans. They wanted the church to be more pure, so they called themselves Puritans. People in England called them Puritans. And they really weren't getting along with people very well. So they decided to start a colony. They asked for a charter from the king. And in the northeast part of the United States is where they ended up landing. They were really trying to hit Virginia, but they ended up landing there. So during this time, you have John Winthrop basically becomes the leader of the Puritans and will be that leader for a very long period of time. You have Massachusetts means at or near the Great Hill. We'll also talk about John Winthrop a little more in class. We're going to look at some of the interactions between people and him. And the colony's first settlement was Boston along the Charles River. Colonial life during this period. Massachusetts and Connecticut had laws that said if there were 50 families, a teacher needed to be hired and a school set up. This originally kind of comes from the fact that the Puritans were trying to teach people how to read so that they could read the Bible. It was really important to them. And these schools that they had set up were called grammar schools or writing schools. Boys went to grammar schools, while girls went to dame schools. There was two separate curriculums for them. Girls were supposed to learn one thing, boys were supposed to learn something else. There's no things like we have today, chalkboards, maps, paper, none of that stuff. Basically just teachers teaching kids stuff, lots of memorization, lots of reading going on, some math. School teachers were strict. They are allowed to hit their students. Puritans believed, remember, that they needed to make sure that they basically would beat the silliness out of their children and try to make them all little adults. And so they weren't very tolerant. Thomas Hooker, he leaves Massachusetts to live in Connecticut because he doesn't like the way the Puritans lived. This happens a lot where the Puritans are an intolerant group of people. So they only like their group, and if people don't agree with it or live differently, and were a sinner, they would be sent out somewhere else. In 1693, you get Connecticut has the first written laws in North America. So thank you, Thomas Hooker. Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is a woman who believed you could go directly to God. So you don't have to pray going through this whole thing. The Puritans have this whole system where they have a hierarchy in the church. People who are obviously good people sit in different places from people who are not, people who are sinners. This goes back to the Scarlet Letter, the book, the really famous book about how they would shame people who committed sins in front of everybody. And the whole community would see them and shun them. And really all she was really doing was basically having Bible studies in her house, and they were reading the Bible together and talking about it. And the men in charge, the people in charge, really didn't enjoy this, didn't want her just controlling things, doing things on her own. So she basically gets banished. Winthrop basically says, all right, you can go. There's this whole thing we're going to look at about her interaction there. But she ends up moving to Providence with Roger Williams, and they start the colony of Rhode Island. you know. Then we have Roger Williams. Roger Williams, whoops, believes you should tolerate people's beliefs in God. He's a tolerance guy. He leaves Massachusetts and starts the colony in Providence, Rhode Island. And Rhode Island basically becomes a haven for anybody. It's all about the tolerance there. And remember, we're not talking equality, we're talking tolerance. So he's basically saying, you can worship in your way, I'll worship in mine, I'll pray my way, you pray yours, and we just leave each other alone. We may not like each other, but at the same time, we leave each other alone. Okay. Puritans also had laws for courtship and that sort of thing, being allowed, but we're not going to go into that today. The middle colonies include New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. They're called the middle colonies because they're in the middle. Yeah, I know, really creative, but that's what they've come up with as naming this. So the middle colonies are these ones right here. They're in between the northeast, who are New England, and down here in the bottom are the southern colonies. So the climate here, good for farming, good for a lot of livestock, lots of rivers around here, which allows good for transportation and getting water to crops. There's a lot of hills, some good harbors, New York Harbor and that. Talked about that with the Dutch. Now this is a tolerant group of people. We've talked about the Dutch and their influence on this region. A lot of people here came from Germany, Scotland, and Ireland and pushed their way in. You have the Quakers, very plain living, peaceful. Yes, the Quaker Oats man is part of that. He's kind of a caricature almost, but he's an advertisement. But that's where that comes from. They were one of the only groups during this period to protest against slavery and say it was bad. And they also were against dancing. Dancing, they said, if you start dancing around, the devil kind of gets into your bones and makes you do bad things that you would never normally do. It gets kind of scandalous if you're dancing around. And we're not talking dancing today like twerking. We're talking, basic, almost not even touching dancing. But they said none, zero. The Germans, there's a bunch of people called the Pennsylvania Dutch, who we now call the Amish. So I got a picture of them here. Skilled workers, really great craftsmen. They still do this stuff today. They sell a lot of things to a lot of people, built out of wood, and that sort of stuff. And you also get the Scots-Irish who farmed and hunted in this area. This area becomes the breadbasket of colonial America. This is where they make the most food, and this is where they're making more food than they can eat themselves, and they're selling that food. So instead of making extra food as a peasant for the king and the nobles, now they're just going to take that food and sell it, and then they take that money and they can use it for whatever they want. They could invest more, buy more land, buy more crops, build something, whatever they decide they want to do. They also invented the Pennsylvania rifle and the Conestoga wagon. And moving on to William Penn. William Penn owned Pennsylvania and made it a place for religious freedom. Again, another religious freedom thing. The Quakers, I do believe, move into there. The Amish move into Pennsylvania and Ohio eventually. They're still there today. I used to see the Amish all the time when I would go camping with the Boy Scouts, and they would race their buggies up and down and their carriages, and they'd always be around. They'd be at McDonald's or whatever. But basically, Pennsylvania was a place for religious freedom, and lots of people settled there. The southern colonies, you have Maryland, you have Virginia, you have North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So those are those, and these are the ones on the bottom. Again, very creative. They're the southernmost colonies, so they're called the southern colonies. The southern colonies' climate was really good in terms of rich land. The land was really good for growing crops. There's plenty of rain down here, further down. There's a long growing season. To this day, the growing season is amazing. I planted tomatoes in my crops, and I'm still getting them now. It's almost the end of September. I'm making this video, September 21st or 20th, and I planted my stuff in early May, mid-May, and really long growing season, whereas my parents' growing season has ended in Ohio. It's pretty much done. It's getting cold now. There's also coastal plains here. It's flatter. There's a flat space between the mountains and the ocean. You have swamps, forests, and some good harbors like the Chesapeake Bay. Good for doing stuff. Maryland was a safe place for Roman Catholics, was originally another group of people who came to the New World. Maryland was a haven because there was all the religious strife going on, so there was a colony made specifically for Catholics. Um, and Georgia was founded by Oglethorpe, who was starting a new place for debtors in England. New idea, basically you get a fresh start. You leave in England. During this period, people were thrown in jail for not paying their debts, which is kind of silly because if you're in jail, how are you ever going to pay a debt? You're never going to get out of jail. But at the same time, this was a revolutionary idea. You go to Georgia, you could grow some crops, you could sell more, you can then pay off your debt. It's actually a pretty interesting idea. So that's where Georgia goes. And Georgia is also used as a buffer against Spanish Florida. Um, planters' duties. During some interesting facts about the southern colonies, you get the plantations grow, they get bigger. The plantations had the planter, who's the owner. They decided what crops were to be planted. They kept the records. They took care of everybody on the plantation because plantations are big, and we'll talk about that more in the third quarter. How big these plantations are. Slavery was necessary they came to the conclusion that slavery was necessary for the southern plantation to grow and keep growing crops. This is a picture of cotton, but really during this time period, the cash crop for Virginia was tobacco. Tobacco, is a huge thing. They make a lot of money. John Rolfe brings it in. They sell a whole bunch, and people get addicted to it and keep selling stuff. So if you have any questions about this for tomorrow, just bring them in and we'll talk about it tomorrow. Hope you guys learned some stuff. Have a good day.